Alright, so I'll just get right into it. As I said, the title is Interpreting the Virgin and Child Within the Spatial Context of the James Rice Tomb. The tomb of James Rice and his wife, Katrina Brown, was originally located in a chantry chapel dedicated to St. James the Elder and St. Catherine of Alexandria, which James Rice had constructed in 1482 off the north side of the former Waterford Cathedral of the Blessed Trinity, demolished in 1773. The tomb is now located in Christ Church Cathedral, Waterford, which was completed in 1779. The tomb is surrounded by images of the 12 apostles, Edward the Confessor, the Trinity, Patrick, Mary, Margaret of Antioch, the Virgin and Child, and Catherine of Alexandria. These images seemingly reflect the spiritual and political interests of James Rice, who was mayor of Waterford 11 times between 1467 and 1486. During his time as mayor, James Rice maintained a close connection to the English crown. This connection with England likely had an impact on the saints he chose to be depicted on his tomb and the ways in which they were fashioned and displayed. This presentation will focus on the image of the Virgin Child flanked by the figures of Margaret of Antioch and Catherine of Alexandria, and placed opposite the image of the Trinity, which is positioned between Edward the Confessor and Patrick. By placing the Waterford tomb in a context of late medieval funerary monuments, the paper will argue that the image of the Virgin Child is related to intercessory Marian prayers, such as the Salve Regina, the Obsecuro Te, and O Intemerata, which were common optional prayers to Mary in late medieval books of hours. This presentation will also discuss the impact of popular Marian devotions on the positioning of the image of the Virgin Child on the James Rice tomb and within the spatial context of the cathedral. James Rice's motivation for choosing the images depicted on the tomb relates back to an obvious concern with death, made clear by the fact that he had the chantry chapel constructed in 1482, within a year before making a pilgrimage journey to the tomb of St. James in Compostela, Spain, for the Jubilee of the Saint in 1483, which included special indulgences for pilgrims given by the Pope. Since the chantry chapel was built to house the tomb, perhaps James Rice was ensuring that if he died on his pilgrimage, he and his wife would have a proper place of burial and a greater chance of getting out of purgatory because of the prayers of the living evoked by the images on the tomb. Eamon McGeaney has described this image of the Virgin and Child as the most outstanding figure on the tomb. And Edwin Ray has said that the high quality of conception and technique used to produce this figure suggests that there was a model used. However, pinpointing the model used is not exactly easy. The conservative style of the image means that the model could have been an image made any time between 1382 and 1482. Edwin Ray suggests that the image may have been based on a local model, possibly a wooden statue brought from Picardy or an English adaptation. The specific statue may be the Waterford Madonna Lactans, currently located at the Waterford Museum of Treasures, which is thought to date from the 14th century. One particular feature of the Rice enthroned Madonna and Child is that the child is holding a bird with both hands. John Bradley noted this detail in his catalogue of images of the Madonna and Child in Ireland, and Edwin Ray and John Hunt have also noted a bird. What makes this bird image particularly fascinating is that it rarely occurs in the Irish context. And the example on the Rice tomb may be the only example of this image in stone, and please correct me later if I'm wrong. The image of the Madonna and Child with the child holding a bird was much more common in 15th century France and Italy, which hints towards a continental influence. However, this type of image can be seen in the 14th century Psalter of Robert de la Sille, and is evidence of its acceptance in England. Some have suggested that when the bird image is portrayed with the enthroned Madonna and Child, it is symbolic of the Holy Spirit. perhaps the Holy Spirit's role in the conception of the child, while others have said that the bird generally refers to the soul in terms of the themes of the passion, death, and resurrection. Yet there may be an even deeper meaning signified by the grasp and attention the child gives to the bird, such as the assurance of salvation. Given that the image is on a tomb, the symbolism of the soul in relation to death and resurrection seems to be a very plausible interpretation. But because of the juxtaposition of this image with the throne of grace image of the Trinity, the bird could very likely be a symbolic representation of the Holy Spirit and his role in conception. In this way, the enthroned Madonna and child with the bird could be viewed similarly to a family photo. The other possibility is that the bird is connected to the narrative of the presentation of the child in the temple, although there is only one bird and the biblical account mentions that two were offered. Upon first sight of the James Rice tomb, most people will not notice the image of the Virgin and Child, but will instantly see the figure of a corpse on the lid, and maybe nothing else if they are so disgusted. The image on the lid of the tomb is a decomposed corpse or transy, similar to some found in England, such as the John Barrett tomb, which, like the Rice tomb, was constructed while the patron was alive. One of the purposes for wealthy patrons like Rice constructing a cadaver tomb was to show their humility in death, since they may have not lived very humbly in life. And another was to represent the soul suffering in purgatory. In this way, the viewer would be prompted to consider his own fate and pray for the deceased via prayers to the Trinity and the saints, such as the Virgin and Child. The well-cut black letter inscription on the Rice tomb makes Rice's intentions and anxiety over death more clear and says, "Here lies James Rice, formerly a citizen of this city and founder of this chapel, and Katrina Brown, his wife. You who stand here, consider what I am, you will be, as I was what you are. I beg you, pray for me, that when it is your fate to pass through the gate of death, our Christ, who has come to redeem the lost, lest the redeemed be damned, will have pity." Arguably, James Rice had specific prayers in mind that he wanted others to pray on behalf of him and his family. And he acknowledged these prayers through the images on his tomb. Rachel Moss has said, "Religious imagery carved in stone almost inevitably draws not from the Gospels, but rather from the oral tradition of prayer. And prayers to the apostles were among these. Edwin Gray has identified the apostles on the tomb and their order as follows. On the sides of the tomb, from left to right, the spectator. On the south side, the apostles Matthias, Jude, Judas Thaddeus, Simon, Matthew, Bartholomew, and Philip. On the north side, James Minor, Thomas, John, James Major, Andrew, and Peter. The apostles appear to be displayed in the sequence of the litany of the saints found in the Roman Missal, with the exception of Paul, at least when read backwards. This sequence is also the same sequence used in the creed of the period, and can therefore be viewed as an illustration of spoken prayer. The order of the apostles may also explain the order in which prayers were offered to the Trinity and other saints by a priest and other chapel attendees. James Rice's potential access to illustrated texts may have influenced his choice of images in relation to the prayers he intended to be prayed on behalf of him and his family. The will of John Cullen, dean of the cathedral from 1441 to 1480, and a close friend of Rice's, mentions that the cathedral library housed, quote, 3 antiphonariae and a psalter, presumably used for the divine office, a book of psalms with a glossary by Richard de Humble, various copies of the Bible and other religious texts, including a genealogy of the Blessed Virgin Mary written in English, and a roll of the Chronicles of England. As most of these types of texts would have been illustrated, especially during the 14th and 15th centuries, it is possible that the images on the tomb may have been connected with images commonly found in any of the above genres. The image of the Holy Trinity at the east end of the monument is a throne of grace style image, which shows the Father enthroned, crowned, and robed. Between his knees is the cross, on which the Son hangs crucified, while between their heads the Holy Spirit hovers in the form of a dove, proceeding from both the Father and the Son. The emphasis of the throne of grace image is on the sacrifice of the Father's only Son, and thus the Eucharistic offering of Christ's body and blood. The throne of grace is commonly found in books of hours and psalters of the 15th century, but also appears in the form of a number of carvings from 15th century England, including sepulchre monuments. And similarly, in Ireland, on the Purcell tomb from circa 1520, currently located in St. Fairberg's Church, Dublin. The positioning of the Madonna and Child image near the head of the transept, opposite the Trinity, throne of grace, enforces Mary's role as crowned Queen of Heaven, while potentially attaching her with the common Salve Regina prayer. Well, the connection of the throne of grace image and the Madonna and Child also lends an element of Eucharistic symbolism and correlation to the Madonna and Child. On the one hand, the Father holds the Son crucified on the cross upon his lap, displaying his sacrifice for sins. On the other hand, the Virgin Mary holds her child, whom she bore with flesh and blood, and presents him with full knowledge of his future sacrifice, as she is already crowned Queen of Heaven. The child is perhaps being symbolically represented as the offering of the bread of the Eucharist, evidencing the idea of the proleptic passion and placing Christ's sacrifice in the minds of those viewing the Madonna and Child. Now, to the right of the image of the Trinity is an image of Edward the Confessor, a well-known English saint who was well respected in Waterford. The use of the image by James Rice may have been connected to his good relationship with Edward IV, king from 1461 to 1483, and other English rulers as a mayoral representative of the English crown in Ireland. This is potentially emphasized by the nearness of the confessor to Patrick, for the tomb maintains an element of Irish identity in the displaying of St. Patrick to the left of the Trinity. And by the late 5th century, Patrick was fully regarded as the patron saint of Ireland. The images of the confessor and Patrick suggest that James Rice was appealing for the prayers of the Gaelic Irish and the Old English of Waterford. At the west end of the tomb is the memorable trio of Saints Margaret and Catherine with the Virgin Mary. Saint Margaret of Antioch is shown with a cross-tipped staff, but lacking the usual dragon. And Saint Catherine of Alexandria is shown with a miniature version of the wheel that was intended for her martyrdom, and the sword that was the weapon of her martyrdom. The three figures commonly appeared together in art of the 15th century Northern Europe, which is this, and can be seen in a similar arrangement on fragments of a tomb in the grounds of a Franciscan abbey, new abbey, at Kilcullen, Kildare. However, the Kilcullen tomb likely dates from some time after the foundation of the friary in 1486 by Roland Fitzeustace, at least 4 years after the construction of the Rice tomb. Prayers and short sermons for Margaret and Catherine were common in Northern Europe and tended to emphasize their roles as virgin martyrs, placing them near the purity of the Virgin Mary. Because of their common portrayal next to the Virgin, Margaret and Catherine could be viewed as Mary's handmaidens, assisting her in her duties as Queen of Heaven. Both Margaret and Catherine are also often included together in the suffrages of saints found in books of hours, and are at times even introduced by the Trinity and the Virgin Mary. The purposeful inclusion of Catherine of Alexandria on the tomb is obvious, considering that the Chantry Chapel was dedicated to her and James the Elder, and she was Katrina Brown's namesake, James Rice's wife. But St. Catherine was also, quote, the patron saint of all who make their living by disputation, which included politicians like James Rice. However, the inclusion of Margaret is less obvious. Her frequent portrayal with Catherine and the Madonna and her status as a virgin martyr make her a worthy candidate. But it was also thought that, quote, all who should write or read the account of her suffrages or celebrate her memorial should receive pardon from any crimes they had committed, and anyone who invoked her will be put to the question should be delivered. Both good bonuses for a politician. The fact that Margaret was also the patron saint of women in childbirth, and Rice's wife was entombed with him, may have also contributed to her inclusion. The primary function of the Madonna and Child on the tomb was to encourage prayer to Mary on behalf of the patron. These prayers were based on the theological concept of Mary as mediator between Christ and sinners. As Christ's mother, Mary was thought to be able to dissuade Christ's wrath against sinners and gracefully allow them into heaven as its queen. In 14th and 15th century books of hours, the enthroned Madonna image was frequently used to introduce prayers such as the Obsecro Te and O Intimorata, which were the most popular optional prayers in books of hours. Considering James Rice's possible access to prayer literature, it is likely that he intended these prayers, as well as the Salve Regina, to be said before his tomb. The Salve Regina prayer would have been one of the most widely known prayers to Mary during the 15th century, and even learned by educated members of society, like James Rice, as children. The prayer was also included in books of hours, such as the 13th century Murphy Hours, made in Paris for use in England. The location of the tomb within the Chantry Chapel and Cathedral further emphasizes the devotional intentions of James Rice. The Cathedral of the Holy and Undivided Trinity, generally known as Christ Church, was the largest church in the city. And James Rice's Chantry Chapel was one of 3 chapels built off of the north side of the cathedral, established by wealthy benefactors or city guilds. For, quote, the chanting or saying of masses for the souls of the dead in purgatory. Although John Cullen, dean of the cathedral, was no longer dean when James Rice began construction of the Chantry Chapel on the 26th of March, 1482, Rice's relationship with John Cullen likely provided the permission he required from the church to build the Chantry Chapel in its given location. In a drawing of the cathedral from 1739, this is before it was demolished, Rice's Chantry Chapel is the small chapel on the far left. The cathedral plan, published in 1739, shows that the Rice tomb would have been located on the viewer's immediate left as they entered the Chantry Chapel, and was directly in line with the main altar of the cathedral, which the plans state is now, main altar of the cathedral. The Chantry Chapel borders the main space of the cathedral and the Trinity Parish Church, which the plans state is now made of no use of. The positioning of the Chantry Chapel close to the altar and the alignment of the tomb with the altar highlights James Rice's wealth and influence, as well as his attempt to ensure prayers from the living on his behalf. It is likely that Rice used his wealth to hire a priest to say masses on behalf of his soul and his family members. Since the entrance of the Chantry Chapel borders the main cathedral space and the parish church, perhaps James Rice was attempting to attract both congregations to his chapel for prayer. Nevertheless, those praying in the chapel would have received the most daylight for viewing the tomb when the sunlight was coming from the north during the evening, as the chapel only had one large north-facing rear-paned window. Whether or not the positioning of the chapel towards evening light determined that evening prayers were most important to the patron is a matter that requires further research. In conclusion, evidence from the construction of James Rice's Chantry Chapel and the images that he chose to be depicted on his tomb, as well as the inscription on the tomb, shows that he was highly concerned with the state of his soul after death and wanted to be remembered after his death. And remembered he was. Even the chapel that he dedicated to St. James and St. Catherine soon became known as Rice's Chapel after his death. At the center of Rice's goal to be remembered was that others would